Okay, hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening to debate the role of cultural institutions in the environmental emergency. We're delighted to have such a great range of speakers here, and we'll introduce them shortly. But first, to contextualise this event at the AA, I am Jessica Reynolds, this is Lilly Jencks, and we teach a unit together here called Experimental 13, Some Like It Hot, Exhibiting in a Warming Climate. In our unit, we are investigating the critical role that cultural institutions play in helping us to understand and act in the climate crisis. Here are some on the screen. Here are some of our unit projects investigating themes such as the importance of collaboration and sharing knowledge between institutions, knowing that the climate crisis crosses all disciplinary and institutional boundaries, ways of breaking down the solid walls of institutions, making them more accessible and porous, accessible to more diverse audiences, because social sustainability is environmental sustainability, celebrating the possible awe-inspiring futures of cloning, future geologies, future wildness, and how to build empathy across the natural world, exploring interspecies communication. So overall, we are asking, how can we redefine what a museum is today in this crisis? And hopefully the conversations tonight will discuss some of these issues. Furthermore, as practicing architects ourselves, Lilly and I often work with cultural institutions, and we're intimately tied up with the contradictions and complexities of delivering projects, from art exhibitions to art spaces, that have direct environmental impacts on waste, energy consumption, and more. So to emphasize the urgency of the problem, here on the screen you can see Bruno Latour's diagram published in Down to Earth, which is a really useful reminder of that the needs of the environmental emergency are not simply a question of adding a green item to the next agenda or taking a tick box approach, but instead demands a total reorientation of politics, ethics, aesthetics, economies, and so on. So he's arguing we need to shift our current, I'll use the pointer, our current axis of politics, which is so the two poles between the local and the global, and he's arguing we need to shift it 90 degrees towards the terrestrial, which kind of indicates the kind of huge reorientation that is required. So the enormity of this shift, where everything is understood as part of a larger earthly framework, where every decision has real consequences, it requires us to act both practically and conceptually, so it can't be one without the other. So why are we focusing on cultural institutions in the climate emergency in this roundtable? Well, because cultural institutions can inform the conversation from these two equally important angles, the practical and the conceptual. So the first, the practical. So museums own estates. There are questions of land ownership and finances. Museums have ever-growing collections requiring more display space, more storage space. So how can architectural refurbishments or extensions or new buildings act positively in the environment? From an operational point of view, museums and cultural institutions are typically energy intensive, so they're very climate-controlled spaces. And often they host fast-paced blockbuster shows which require transporting large cultural institutions around the world, as well as staff around the world, while exhibition designs are often discarded after their 3-month show. So the second issue is the conceptual. Cultural institutions have a critical role to play in making sense of this necessary world shift through their curatorial programming, which has the ability to construct a new cultural discourse and catalyse us into action. So how these museums engage with their audiences, create new audiences, and educate, communicate through the visitor experience is vital to addressing this crisis. So responding to the enormity and gravity of Bruno Latour's demand for radical new alignment towards the terrestrial, what organisation is better equipped to tackle these difficult, uncomfortable questions than a cultural institution? It's a terrifying situation, but we can engage with it creatively and positively. And we're so pleased to welcome our speakers to the school, who Lilly will introduce now.
Thank you, Jess. Is that working? So I think our speakers tonight, I hope, will all be able to address this huge paradigm shift that Jess is pointing to, Bruno Nador is pointing to. They all run or work with major cultural institutions in London and use these platforms as a place for catalysing the new consciousness, new communities, and new action in the climate emergency, both practical and conceptual. And like the AA, several of them have made their own formal declarations on the climate emergency and have written institution-wide manifestos, many of which read like a call to arms, which we'll hear more about later. Nick Merriman will start the presentations today. He's the CEO of the Horniman Museum since May 2018. The Horniman Museum, if you don't know, is in Forest Hill in South London, and it is an incredible museum that brings together art and nature on a kind of equal footing. It's the only place where you see art and culture together indoors and outdoors, where the oldest nature trail in London is given equal footing as kind of beautiful cultural man-made artifacts. In July 2019, the Horniman declared a climate and environmental emergency, and this January they launched a manifesto outlining their plan for action. Nick has been massively involved in public outreach and building new audiences around this agenda. He stated, "Our mission at the Horniman connects us with all the global cultures and natural environment, encouraging us to shape a positive future for the world we all share. As a much loved and trusted institution with close to 1 million visitors each year, the Horniman has a moral and ethical imperative to act now." Catherine Ince will present second today. She's the Chief Curator of the V&A East Project at the Victoria and Albert Museum. This project is part of the expansion and outreach by the V&A to engage with different communities and audiences who are underserviced around London. The V&A East will open in 2023 as part of East Bank, a major new cultural and education district planned for the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park. It will include the O'Donnell and Toomey designed museum and a new research and collection centre by Dulles Video and Renfrew. The extension of the V&A raises many relevant questions about how to grow while taking into account the responsibility of social and environmental sustainability. Before, Catherine Ince was at the Barbican and curated the excellent exhibitions such as The World of Charles Rains and the Bauhaus, both of which I personally felt while visiting them that they were kind of pushing the idea of the designer as an activist. And I think that Catherine herself kind of seems to push this quite, seeing how a curator as well as a designer can actively engage in the creation of new culture as well as archiving the past, which is usually the role of a museum. Camilla Tam joins us from the Natural History Museum, an institution which has taken on the mantle of being a global scientific and cultural leader in the environmental emergency. The Natural History Museum declared a climate emergency on the 20th of January 2020. Interestingly, the same day that the Horniman Museum presented their manifesto on the climate emergency, which is a coincidence. 20/01/2020 was an auspicious date. The Natural History Museum claims it will become the first in the world to set a science-based carbon reduction target in line with the goal of keeping climate change under 1.5 degrees of warming. Camilla's particular role as an Anthropocene engagement manager is to raise awareness of the current state of the planet through engagement with the museum's collections and scientific research. It is an interesting role because it is cross-departmental and explicitly collaborative, and galvanizes audiences in positive change for the future. Camilla is currently working to establish a global network of museums, science centres and like-minded organisations who are committed to engaging audiences with the Anthropocene and addressing what it means for humanity in terms of addressing the past, present and future of our planet. Those slightly long-winded introductions are to give you guys all a sense of what's to come. Once everybody's presented for 5 minutes, we'll have a conversation amongst us, and we'd love to reach out into the audience. I know that today there are people here from AA Action, which is the AA environmental group in the audience. So many of our students are here who are designing museums in relation to the cultural emergency. So this is a conversation to be engaged with everybody here. So please jump in after the presentations.
And just one thing to add is that unfortunately Lucia Pietrusti from the Serpentine Galleries couldn't be here today. So, but that's okay because we have great speakers. So Nick, would you like to proceed?
Okay. Can I just check if it's 5 minutes or 10 minutes? Because I think
Take your,
Well,
5 to 10.
try and keep it. Okay. Try and keep it short.
Up to 10.
Yeah. Well, hello everybody, and sorry I've got I'm turning my shoulder to half of you. Great to be here. I'm going to rattle through what we've been doing at the Horniman since I arrived just slightly less than 2 years ago. Because I came in and I'll tell you actually, first of all show you what the Horniman is. So the Horniman, as Lilly said, is a museum and gardens actually, which occupies this site in Forest Hill in the borough of Lewisham. And it's in fact, I'll just go back one to say that it's got the museum buildings here, and the gardens here, and then a half-mile-long nature trail, London's oldest nature trail on a former railway line there. And it's an interesting hybrid organisation because it's got classic museum collections of worldwide anthropology and natural history and one of the world's best collections of musical instruments, but it's also got 16.5 acres of gardens, plus the nature trail, and an aquarium that's been there since 1904, and live animals, a collection of domestic animals, which are too small to be called a zoo, and a butterfly house as well. So when I arrived, I said to people, okay, what is the Horniman? And they said, oh, well, it's a list of things. And the mission was really about promoting an appreciation of world cultures and natural environments through our collections. And I felt that was very weak in the situation we'd been in, because that mission was dated back to 1989. So looking back to the founding impulse of Frederick Horniman, who was a tea merchant and raised a Quaker with a strong sense of social justice and bringing the world to Forest Hill, as he said, to promote understanding between cultures rather than showing the triumph of Western civilization. Did a lot of work with staff to re-encapsulate the mission of the Horniman, as we realised it was London's only museum where nature and culture can be seen side by side at the global level. So we felt that put us in a fantastic position to actually address some of the issues around the climate and ecology emergency and related issues, social issues such as global migration. So cutting to the chase, we developed fairly rapidly a new mission which was about connecting us with global cultures and natural environments, encouraging us to shape a positive future for the world we all share, because we were very aware that it's a lot of doom and gloom around environment and climate, and we know it's a majority family audience with small children coming to the Horniman, and we know from visitor research the parents and grandparents and carers are really worried about the future these quite small children are going to be growing up in, and often feel quite overwhelmed and powerless in it. So we wanted very much to look at positive actions, and our underlying goal, I suppose, in all of the work we're doing with the public, and we have nearly 1 million visits a year, is to create active citizens who are active consumers and citizens in the sense of exercising their choices about lobbying corporations and governments for change. So we're not only doing stuff in our galleries, but it's a very strong positive engagement remit that we have. So quickly moving on, some of the things flowing from that mission are as follows. As I said, all of the climate and biodiversity, waste and pollution material becomes central. Like many organisations and museums, we've had a sustainability working group, which has been full of very keen people doing stuff at the margins of their existing jobs, with difficulty making progress. We've now said this is absolutely central, as is our equality and diversity work. Partly to deal with the large numbers of visitors, we're embarking on a capital project, or 2 capital projects over the next 10 years, but the main one here is called Nature and Love, And it consists of a refurbishment of our natural history gallery, which hasn't been touched for about 60 years, and a bit of our aquarium, because actually, as a side note, we're the first aquarium in the world to captively breed coral in our tanks in Forest Hill, and we're accelerating evolution sixfold by breeding coral which is more tolerant of warmer waters, and therefore with the aim of repopulating bleached reefs in the long term. We're calling it nature and love because the word love is the one that comes up most frequently in relation to the Horniman. People say, oh, I love the Horniman. I really love the Horniman. And we remind people that Frederick Horniman, as a philanthropist, philanthropy means love of people. And in thinking about how you can harness, how you can garner positivity about the challenges we face, there's quite a lot of work gone on now. So the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research does as much work on behavioural psychology now about why people change or don't change as it does on the science, because the science is pretty undisputed now. It's why people aren't doing anything. And one way of actually getting people to become active in their own lives is to appeal to their, not, oh, what can I do about the glaciers or the rainforest, but what can I do personally to create a better future for my children or grandchildren or whatever it may be. So it's the love of the next generation as a motivating force for personal action. So the Nature and Love project has a number of different components. We're also, one of those is we have a membership of 8,500 family memberships, about 35,000 people. We're going to co-opt some of those, we hope a few hundred, in an environmental champions scheme to be supported with tips, resources, a coordinator, badges and so on for children to undertake their own waste and carbon reduction program, with the club providing support and benchmarking that people can motivate. For people to motivate themselves. And the idea is to try and prove a concept which we might then persuade other membership organisations to roll out, other museums, the National Trust perhaps with its many millions of members. We've renamed our sustainability working group to a climate and ecology action group to make it active, and just about to appoint our first full-time coordinator. Here's an example of some of the, so that's all about creating active citizens through engagement with what we do, and about getting our own house in order. In terms of our own house in order, our cafe is now plastic-free entirely, only uses sustainable, fair trade, free range and local suppliers. 30% of the menu is now vegan and vegetarian. Last year, as I say, we replaced 26 items of single-use plastic with vegware, which is a compostable plant-based alternative, which meant in the first 6 months 100,000 individual pieces of single-use plastic were removed from circulation. We now provide free water, tap water refills in our cafe and on site, and 90% of water the visitors and staff use on site is now from free sources. There is still a demand for packaged water because some people don't want to have tap water. We now sell water in cans, and that's again led to 24,000 single-use plastic water bottles per year not being sold. We're also doing programming around climate and ecology action. We had a big program on plastic pollution, as I say, not only in our shop and cafe. Last year, for 2 months, in our aquarium, we dumped a load of plastic rubbish. So you can see a frog there with a load of plastic crap around it, and there's another frog there, poison dart frog. The animals, I hasten to add, were not harmed during this because the plastic was there just for a brief period. In our jellyfish tank, we took all the jellyfish, which are usually swirling around, out into tanks to back of house and replaced them with plastic bags swirling around with quite in-your-face labelling. And people were really shocked, because one thing they don't expect to see in museum cases or aquarium tanks is a load of rubbish. There's an assumption that it'll be nice looking. And some people got quite upset, but it prompted action. So one small child was so upset and then angry, she went home and did a 20-page booklet on plastic pollution, which she and her mum then sent to our local MP. So great, that's the kind of active citizenship we want to include. We actually have a turtle on long-term loan from the Natural History Museum. You can't see it very well, which we then displayed with a load of plastic netting and so on. We do a lot of work with artists. This is still there, Claire Morgan. Installation in our entrance hall of plastic waste recovered from beaches and made into spheres, and then a bespoke taxidermy for four species that are found on our site, fox, crow, etc., spewing out plastic waste in a kind of revolting kind of way. We did, in the autumn, a show with Project Pressure, an artist collective, showing artist photographs of melting glaciers around the world. This one, for example, in Fire, shows the former earlier 20th century limit of the glacier. And as Lilly said, we declared an emergency in July 29 and launched a manifesto last month. It's available online. It's a punchy two-pager, but we say, for example, that we're going to reach greenhouse gas neutrality in 2040, recycle 90% of our organic food, reuse 200,000 litres of aquarium water a year, etc., etc. What we're doing now is working out in practice what it actually means to retrofit an early 20th century building that's reliant on gas heating for a sustainable, probably renewable electric and solar and earth pump or air source heat pump future, which is a big topic. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Catherine. Yep. Okay.
I'm going to probably pivot this way and that way.
Would you like to switch places? Why don't you come here?
Sure.
Yeah, why don't we switch? Because then you can see.
Can I, though? Can you see? You can see that one. Oh, I can see the computer. Excellent, thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation to join you this evening. I'm going to focus on what we're doing programmatically rather than the sort of practicalities and operational aspect of the museum, which I think we can talk about when we talk around some of these issues. And I wanted to start, first of all, with the principle of collecting. We're, for those of you who don't know the V&A, we have two sites here in London, the Museum in South Kensington and the Museum of Childhood in Bethnal Green. We're a national museum with collections across art, design, architecture, graphic design, photography, painting, sculpture, ceramics, glass, textiles, fashion, furniture, objects from portions of the world, including significant holdings from East Asia, South Asia, the Islamic world. So if you haven't been, please do come and visit South Kensington. But we're also actively acquiring all the time. And one of the collections that I wanted to draw your attention to is our rapid response collecting initiative, which started a few years ago and was about sort of trying to collect design and creativity that has a very specific sort of social purpose and social dimension or commentary, or is signifying the ways in which design is shaping society. And so this sort of duality of work, but it's also rapid in that we are following news and following situations and seeking to bring objects into the museum in a very quick way, which sounds like it's like should be simple, acquiring things. It's quite a slow process of acquisition and signing it off and what are we collecting. And this process sort of cuts out a lot of some of the sort of bureaucracies that exist in the museum, rightly so, but it allows us to be very, very, very responsive and reactive to what's going on in the world. We have a suite of galleries which are currently closed actually and will reopen in the summer as part of our new 20th century and contemporary design galleries in which rapid response will be embedded. And it means that the team who collect and make and process those acquisitions can get them straight out into the museum almost immediately, sometimes the same day, depending on what it is. And one of the things that we've been focused on in the past year is the activity of Extinction Rebellion. We wanted to
we had been watching and looking at what was happening with this group, and we felt it was particularly pertinent to the sort of activism that was happening in London, and the use of design to further their story, their agenda. But grassroots groups are often very skeptical of establishment institutions such as the V&A, and it took a long time and careful conversations and very sort of rooted work with key figures in the movement, including the designer of the identity of Extinction Rebellion, if you like. And we were able to agree a suite of objects from woodblocks that are used for printing through to what you just saw on the previous slide, examples of the imagery and messaging that they carry through banners, through posters, through different media. And this is a very sort of important sort of part of our work in bringing forward issues to the museum and contrasting socio-political context with a typical sort of focus on a lens of art design history, which doesn't always acknowledge the conditions of making or reaction that leads to some of the things we hold in our collection. We've had quite a significant backlash on this acquisition and it's divided opinion. Our core sort of regular audiences are finding it difficult that we would collect such things. They don't recognize necessarily the inherent sort of creative value of that, but also feel that this group is unnecessarily disruptive. So this is an interesting debate that the museum is sort of squarely in the middle of, but it's also important for other audiences that we have who feel that the museum should have a position, and it should have a point of view, and should be a platform for discussion in this way. And Corinna Gardner, who is the curator who leads our rapid response collecting, has a brilliant job, but also has the job of answering every single one of the letters that she gets to explain why we collect such things. So our exhibitions program is also enormous and voraciously consumes energy in all sorts of different ways. And there are questions around, the notion of the temporary exhibition and how you recycle, how it tours, objects traveling to and from different institutions. And these are very live inquiries within the museum sector, I think it's fair to say. And there are lots of different initiatives that the museum is part of, where cases display materials used to recycle, repurpose for different ends. But what I wanted to sort of foreground here were a few recent shows that we've staged that have brought to the fore a sort of contemporary lens and contemporary practice with provocations about how we tackle the future. These exhibitions feel quite markedly different from the typical sort of exhibition program of the V&A, and signals a sort of shift in our commitment to platforming contemporary practice, but also taking a kind of thematic, ideas-led approach to what's going on in the world today and what art, design, creativity is doing to shape our society and address particularly the sort of environmental issues. The Future Starts Here was staged in 2018. It was curated by Rory Hyde, who's our curator of architecture and urbanism, and Mariana Pestana, who's was a curator brought into the museum specifically to work on this project, who's now back in Lisbon doing lots of freelance things, but also about to curate the Istanbul Design Biennale later on this year, with a subject of empathy, about how we can change our sort of view to the world and our relationship with nature through the sort of idea of empathy, which has its root in sort of early 20th century philosophy, and it's a very exciting project that she's building. So these working with curators who come into the museum for a period of time and inflect and change what we do and challenge the institutional thinking to push in different directions is also a very critical dimension of the ambition that we have as an institution. I wanted to also flag food, which was Bigger Than the Plate, which was staged last year, curated by Catherine Flood, who typically looks after our prints and 20th century sort of poster art collections, but has staged. This is the second of her major gallery shows. The first was Disobedient Objects, which was also a very interesting exhibition looking at amateur design practices for the purposes of activism, people who collectivize to to further their sort of political point of view, and the different way of understanding our kind of contemporary vision and material culture. And food was a great exhibition that took kind of the roots of the foundational collections of the South Kensington museums, which came together, formed largely out of the Great Exhibition in 1851. And before the the Science Museum and the V&A were founded, they were one institution. Then we sort of split in art and design terms and craft terms, and science and technology in another way. But we have this sort of weird waste food collection, which nobody really knows what to do with, and sort of sits in store, and everybody's sort of like, oh, I don't know how to cope with this. So this project was really kind of looking back at the history of the museum and sort of industrialization of food and food production, and brings it right up to date, including sort of experimental projects which look at which we brought into the gallery, and living entities in the gallery where we're growing mushrooms and other projects. So it was an amazing opportunity to sort of use the long history of the museum's collections to inflect and think about how practitioners are addressing ways of living and sustainable development today. It's a great catalogue if you're particularly interested in this subject. And it was an opportunity to foreground some of the initiatives that are happening in the part of London where I'm working on the V&A East project, where artists like Catherine Bohm are experimenting with art practice as social enterprise and food production. She started her own drinks company, is recovering sort of practices of hop picking in that part of London, and founded her own sort of ethical company as an artist project, which is super interesting, and it was great to see that presented in the gallery. And then another significant project for us, just to emphasize the point of the ways in which the historic collections can catalyze lots of exciting fertile sort of territory for researchers, for industry. We presented Fashion from Nature in 2018, which looked at fashion's preoccupation with the natural world through representation, through literal use of animal skin or birds' feathers and natural products, to today's world of agitation by the likes of Vivienne Westwood about the fashion industry, people like Catherine Hamnett, who've been critical in looking at water consumption in the production of cotton textiles particularly. But this interest in how historic collections can catalyze sort of current research is another dimension of our work that I wanted to talk about today. It's not just exhibition making and it goes away. It's underpinned by lots of longer term research projects where we have conservation material scientists in the museum who are looking at preserving and conserving our collections through material understanding. But then also collaborating with different partners on devising new materials, devising new products, new techniques, ways of answering some of the world's challenges. And it's quite interesting when you see this on the left-hand side here is a new material that's made by pineapple leaf fiber. It's part of a kind of big research program funded by the AHRC that the V&A is one partner in, looking at fashion, textiles, technology, innovation. We are looking at the historic collections as a method of kind of, sparking forth new material production. And then you look back to the 19th century, and there's a dress on the right from the Bose Museum as a loan to us, but it's partly made by a pineapple leaf and silk fibre that was produced in the 19th century. So there's lots to suggest that it's not just about sort of jettisoning the past, but it's coming towards and thinking in new ways about the meaning, relevance, and potential inspiration and ideas that can flourish from a collection such as the V&A. I'm going to speed up. Sorry, I realise I'm got quite a lot to cover. So the new project in East London, as Lilly said, is part of a kind of new quarter in the Olympic Park that's delivering on the kind of legacy plan of the Olympic Games. It's been through a long process, and we have arrived at this position for the V&A. We're building a new museum designed by John and Toomey and a collection research centre. And this, I'll spare you all of the convoluted history of what it takes to do massive capital projects like this, but this motivation is in part because the V&A in 2015 was informed by the Department of Culture that we needed to move out of the building where we house a lot of our collection that's not on display. We have about 2.5 million objects in the museum and around 1,000 archives. Most of our three-dimensional holdings are not in South Kensington. They're in a place called Blythe House in West Kensington, where we've been housed with the British Museum and the Science Museum for 35 years. And we were told, we're selling the building, it's going to become flats, you've got to find somewhere else to go. So we had to, I'm sure there was more conversation than that, but that's the Cliff's Notes for you. So we had this sort of, opportunity to think about what we do with our collection. This is our entire collection of textiles, fashion, furniture, Asian objects, architectural fragments, sculpture, some metalwork, ceramics, Islamic objects, big rooms that we don't put on display in the museum because we don't have any space. So we were sort of going through a sort of second round of master planning, decided to really go for it and create a sort of new typology of centre that is neither store nor museum, sort of somewhere in between, opening up the collections for public enjoyment, public discovery, but also critically for us creating new spaces for research, teaching, study of objects. And what you're seeing here is the sort of early conceptual design for that project by Diller and Scafidio. But together, V&A East and then the museum will have collection galleries, a major exhibition space and a project space. Together, what we really want to do is sort of reposition our collections for today's world, to be a collaborative partner, working with other partners on the park, working with a constellation of arts organisations, schools, businesses, individual practitioners in and around East London, connecting globally and really using it as a platform for thinking through today's world and making sense of the world. And this, the museum as a site of discussion, of provocation, of a space for thinking through these challenges is an important aspect of what we do. One of the sort of small elements of, or not small, significant elements of that I just wanted to sort of share with you today. All of this is in evolution, in making at the moment, but one of the galleries at the Waterfront Museum will be a project that we will co-curate with the Smithsonian Institution for the first 2 years of V&A East life, and it's looking at the sort of the question of the Anthropocene and humanity's sort of effect of and relationship with the planet. The collaboration with the Smithsonian allows us to bring collections of art and design and performance together with natural history, with science, technology, visual art, contemporary art like Agnes Dennis. And we're looking at projects like this, which, in the 80s were fantastic sort of, interventions into the city, questioning, inquiring, special moments. And she's in her 80s now. She's only just had her first retrospective, which was on at the Shed last year. So there's time to sort of recover practitioners, but also rethink our relationship to the natural world. And that's one of the sort of purposes of the exhibition, or the program that we are devising, is like thinking about adopting a sort of whole earth thinking, if you like. This is the original blue marble photograph taken by NASA pilots on Apollo 17, which has become the most sort of reproduced image in the world. We hold one in our collection. This is the original NASA photograph. But it's about sort of shifting people's thinking, and it's shifting through understanding and exploring practical solutions, but also your behavior, and recalibrating our relationship with the natural world. And the program will include objects and experiences that you encounter in the gallery, but we're also at the moment testing the ways in which we can embed live research as action and active research, but also as forms of public engagement. How can we bring local initiatives into the gallery where we've got citizens, scientists, or local organisations who might be trying to encourage use of the Lee Valley and the waterways that are around the Olympic Park. So we're testing how we can make the gallery a space, a site of action, of inquiry, of discussion. And particularly interesting to us too is that how do we problematize the objects in our collection? That's a nice mahogany clothes press from the 18th century, but it also is a product of the intense logging out of the Caribbean at this time. How do we bring post-colonial narratives through the sort of environmental lens to our collections and look at them in different ways, and not just as examples of craftsmanship and decorative objects, but as moments in time that had devastating, wide-reaching effects. And I'm going to end. And the last thing that we're also thinking about, and hopefully I'll be joining a panel at Westminster in the summer, looking at the idea of environmental racism, which is a territory of inquiry that our colleagues at the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture are particularly interested in and preoccupied in with their collections, with their programs, and their research. And we have acquired a section of Robin Hood Gardens at the point of demolition, which is quite typical for the museum that collects architectural fragments. We have typically done that throughout our inception. This is a controversial move for the V&A. We will be putting Robin Hood Gardens into the collection centre at V&A East. And for me, as I grew up in this part of London, it's very significant. Potent object, an example of innovative public housing. We can talk about it in architectural terms, but we must also talk about it in terms of who benefits from urban development. How do we communicate lived experience? What are the pros and cons of both the effects on the environment, but also people who live in those environments? And we're looking at objects in the Smithsonian's collections like this mile marker from the Dakota pipeline protest, which is a different form of environmental racism. And can be contextualized and explored in a lot of ways. So these sort of local stories that allow us to, stretch to global relevance and resonance are some of the things that we are exploring at V&A East. And I'll just leave you with Buckminster Fuller, because it's always nice to look at Bucky Fuller. This is another print from our collection. There we are. So hopefully a flavour of some of the ways programmatically that we will be exploring these ideas.
Thank you. Shall I shift over there as well?
Yeah, it's quite nice to have your slides.
Yes.
I stole your picture there for the title slide there. Quite a small one for the slide. Okay, so I planned for 10 minutes as well, which for me usually means about 12 or 13 minutes. So I'll try and speak quickly. Okay, so hi, my name's Camilla. I work at the Natural History Museum in London, and I am Anthropocene Engagement Manager. And in the next few minutes, I'm just going to whip you through a few things. So a little bit about my role and the museum to give you a bit of context, a few words about our new strategy, which was launched a month ago today, a little bit about our kind of approach to sustainability. I should quickly caveat that by saying that's not my area of expertise, but I pulled together a little bit of information because it felt relevant for today. And then I'll say a bit more about our approach to public engagement, and in particular off the back of the launch of our new strategy. So while I tell you a bit about my post, I'm just going to show you what is arguably my favourite gallery in the museum. This is the Minerals Gallery. If you haven't seen it before, I'd definitely recommend you go. It's probably one of the only galleries in the museum that's remained pretty much unchanged since it opened in 1881. So I've been at the museum for a bit under 6 years. For the majority of that time, I've worked in science communication. So I've worked in the team, led the team, and that's been principally about working with our museum scientists to raise public awareness of the collections, how they're used, and the scientific research that's conducted at the museum. With this new post, it was created by the museum in July, August last year, so it's only been a few months. But in very broad strokes, the key things I'm kind of scoping out are how should the Natural History Museum be thinking about, talking about, engaging our audiences with Anthropocene-related concepts. So things like the climate crisis, biodiversity loss, land use change, species extinction, all that kind of messy stuff. How should we go about doing that? I'm also considering, well, how might we reinterpret our collections? How can we look at our collections and start to tell slightly different stories that really connect with people? And who are the other organisations around the world who are committed to the same kinds of visions and missions? How could we work with them? How might we share best practice so that we're not working completely in isolation and we could be working as a joined-up network to have broader reach? So here's the museum. I should say I know nothing, literally nothing about architecture, embarrassingly, but I'm fairly confident in saying that I think this is one of the most beautiful buildings, certainly in London. It was designed by an architect called Alfred Waterhouse, and it was founded by a guy called Richard Owen, who is the person who coined the term dinosaur. And when the museum opened its doors on the 18th of April, 1881, Owen very much wanted it to feel like a cathedral to nature, was the phrase that he used. And I like to think they pretty much achieved that. So there's the museum today, and that's our blue whale skeleton Hope hanging from the ceiling there. And so today the museum houses a little bit over 80 million specimens. We have 300 scientists who work there, and last year we welcomed 5.4 million visitors through our doors. And how lucky we are to have that kind of incredible reach. So a few words about our strategy. As I mentioned, it was launched a month ago today, and the most prominent thing about it, of course, is that we declared a planetary emergency. It's readily available on our website if you'd like to check it out. But in that strategy, you'll see that we say in no uncertain terms that we're living in an unprecedented time with respect to human impact on the natural systems that we depend upon. And we need an unprecedented response if we have any hope of having any kind of positive future. It also lays out our vision and mission. So our vision is of a future where people and planet thrive, and we have a mission to create advocates for the planet. So there's lots of different stuff in there in terms of focus areas, strategic priorities. One tiny nugget I wanted to pull out, because again, it felt sort of relevant for this discussion, is we talk a bit about how knowledge and understanding that's born out of scientific research and discovery is crucial for us to address some of these issues, but it's not sufficient on its own. And of absolute equal importance is appropriate engagement, whether that's with policy makers, decision makers, our public audiences, who are obviously also decision makers themselves. That's a little bit about our strategy. With respect to our kind of approach to sustainability, so when we launched new strategy, we had a few changes on site as well, and some of that was around the visible kind of text and branding that we had for our visitors on our digital screens, as well as you can see, on the doors to our shops. This is the most text-heavy slide that I have, so don't panic. So just a few things with respect to sustainability. The first point was mentioned in the introduction. And like everywhere else, we're looking at ways we can reduce our carbon emissions, from heat pumps in our energy centre to installing solar panels. So at our sister museum, so we also have a natural history museum in Tring, and I believe that's happening right now. The solar panels are being installed, with the hope being that the ornithology building can then essentially power itself. So LED lighting installed as standard, setting low carbon, high energy efficiency standards for building projects. So right from day zero, right from that planning stage, that intent is absolutely sort of planned in there. Recycling set work, so seating, walls, other kinds of exhibition materials wherever possible. Where it's not possible, I believe there's sort of a free cycle scheme that exists between institutions. So if we can't use it, maybe the V&A can use it, that sort of thing. And importantly, working with key suppliers. So I believe it's sort of predominantly our top 30 suppliers, to kind of nudge them to improving their approach to environmental sustainability. So that might mean, a catering supplier, if their environmental standards aren't what we think they should be, it might be a case of saying to them, okay, well, you have a year to improve your situation, otherwise we'll move on. Just to give you an example of some of the sort of text that went out in our catering spaces and our shops, this is really kind of, I guess, about a couple of things. So making it clear to our visitors that this is on our minds and that we're not perfect by any means, of course. These things can't change overnight. But making it very clear that we're mindful of this, and these are some of the steps that we're taking, small changes. And also, I kind of think about, well, when a visitor comes to the museum, they see this and they think, okay, cool, the Natural History Museum's thinking about these things. But also when they leave, when they then go and do their own food shopping or clothes shopping, maybe they'll just be more mindful of that kind of stuff once they see this more and more in places like our museum. And we also wanted to publish some key actions that you can kind of do as an individual. And many of these will be very familiar to you. We're not unique in putting these out there, but but it was about time that we did put some of these things out there. So these are on our website as well, and they were on our digital screens for the week of our strategy launch. And I think they're 8 or 9 actions, and they sort of range from thinking about how you travel and if you need to travel in that way, through to thinking about your waste, trying to eat sustainably. And I've included a screenshot of this one because I think it's arguably the most important one. So really using your voice and making your voice heard, whether that's with your friends and family or your local councillor, your local MP. And so just a few words about our approach to public engagement. So our audience research information currently sort of predominantly tells us that we tend to be seen as a place for educational learning for families and schools, which is great, and we would never want to lose that. It's so crucial. But given the time that we're living in now, we're starting to think about, okay, well, how might we actually go further and use our USPs to drive change? So when I say USPs, I principally mean our world-renowned collections, our pool of scientific expertise, and our reach that we're lucky enough to have physically and digitally online. And I was saying this earlier when we were at the bar, but I think the element of trust really can't be taken for granted at the moment, at a time of extreme complexity, fragmented truths and disinformation. It's generally shows in audience research data that museums are still relatively trusted spaces that feel unbiased, and that's really important, and I think we just can't take that for granted. We're very lucky to have that, I think. So the way when people come to our museum, that's my niece, by the way, like a lot of small children, she's fairly obsessed with dinosaurs. So when people come to our museums, quite a few of them kind of come for some of those quite sort of charismatic specimens. So the dinosaurs, the polar bears, the giraffes, the beautiful insects. Those are moths, by the way. People tend to think they're butterflies, but all of them, I think, bar one, are moths. And that point of awe and inspiration and that wow factor, again, is really crucial for hooking people in and connecting them with the natural world. But as I was alluding to before, now we want to think about how can we kind of nudge people further. So perhaps going from, wow, that's cool, and walking off, to, wow, that's cool, I want to know more. And then from, okay, I want to know more, to, now I know more, I care about it. And then on to, now I know more, I'm invested, I care about it. How can I use my voice? What can I do? How can I take action? How can I speak up for nature, which is essentially how we define an advocate for the planet at the museum. This is just summarising what I was just saying. Very broadly speaking, we want to inspire, inform, and empower, but these things can't happen overnight, of course. So I just want to say something very briefly about our permanent gallery spaces. Some of these are old. They've looked the way that they look for a pretty long time, and the pace at which things are changing now, sometimes that doesn't feel ideal. But permanent galleries can take years to transform and to do it well. And so currently, when you walk through our museum, when we consider Anthropocene-related concepts, so take the climate crisis, for example, we don't really have a very prominent, strong, storyteller-driven narrative about the climate crisis. We have some stuff. So this is a picture of a couple of panels in a gallery called From the Beginning. And there's nothing wrong with these panels. There's nothing erroneous about them. There's nothing factually incorrect. But you can see when you look at the language that it doesn't feel contemporary. It doesn't feel like there's a call to action. It doesn't really match where the kind of social place is. And so, if you look at the panel on the left, we talk about chlorofluorocarbons. I mean, CFCs is a discussion, a debate that's come and gone. The language on the right, changing climate, question mark, that's just not something that we would do now. That we know the climate is changing. There's no question about that. And saying things like, as the temperature increases, there will be an increase in the number of severity. That's already happened. We've already seen that. We're living in that time at the moment. And so there's nothing drastically wrong with it, but as is stated in our strategy, we will be looking to transform some of our public spaces. So we highlight things like interconnectivity and humans being part of a bigger system, and weaving in storytelling and narratives that really do motivate change rather than focusing too much on just presenting facts. The facts are important, but as I mentioned earlier, they're not enough. And so just the last couple of minutes, I just wanted to say that where we can be a bit more agile is through some of our public engagement programming and our public events. So I'll give you one very brief example, which is our Lates programme. So like a lot of other museums, we have a lates program. We stay up until 10 p.m. the last Friday of every month, and every lates has a theme. And these two pictures are from a lates that we delivered just over a year ago. So in November 2018, we partnered with the Natural Environment Research Council, so they're all about environmental science. And we commissioned a theatre maker company called Coney. And a few different elements were involved in the night. So you can see the most obvious one here. That giant earth is not always there, sadly. So that is an artistic installation by an artist called Luke Jerem. And that's basically a 7-meter in diameter globe with detailed NASA imagery on the surface, and it's illuminated from the inside. And that being there for the night was very much, I don't know if any of you have heard of the overview effect, but it's what a lot of astronauts report to sort of feel when they glance back at our planet and they see our home as being this kind of fragile, isolated, only place that we can call home. And so it was really beautiful, and I think quite kind of provocative in terms of how our audiences engage with looking at it. We also had pop-up science stations with specimens from our collections and scientists engaging with people. We had interactive talks throughout the night where people could reflect on their concerns, ask their questions to our experts. And these topics range from things like melting ice in Antarctica to microplastics to palm oil to coral reefs. And the whole night was about talking about the environmental crisis that we live in, but also championing positivity too. So looking at the cutting edge environmental science that is very much out there, but maybe gets slightly less talked about compared to the kind of the scary stories. But what I thought was quite exciting about this night and was slightly different was what Coney did for us, so that the theatre maker company. So a couple of examples. They made a card game for our visitors to engage with. It was called Let's Talk About Climate Change. Very niche, sounds a bit boring, but it's actually great. And why I love the card game is when you play it, it sort of forces you to participate, to use your voice, to share your views, your opinions, and your attitudes, which I think as social science tells us is so important and how we address the climate crisis. And similarly, they delivered a performance called How We Save the World. And it was really straightforward. It was just 2 actors on stage in our lecture theatre. And they basically, they acted out different scenarios, and they invited the audience to participate and steer and direct their conversation and responses to one another in that scenario. And these scenarios ranged from a house party in East London to you're a smallholder farmer in Indonesia. And it did, I think it did a great job of really highlighting the nuanced complexities that we have to think about and address with things like the environmental emergency, that things are very rarely black and white. There are trade-offs and priorities that you have to think about. And I loved what that performance did, because again, it encouraged people to use their voice, participate, see the consequences of actions, that sort of thing. And we saw some really great engagement from people. Oh, that's the card game, those orange cards there. And we had the blackboards out there because we wanted people to just reflect and tell us how they were feeling about the night and the issues that were raised. So that was an example of something where I think, it's a kind of direction we could go in a bit more playful, a bit more participatory, and understanding the nuances along the way. So my last slide is just to say, here are some thoughts, amongst many others, that I'm thinking about in terms of the future of our approach to public engagement. How can we use our collections to tell more provocative stories and narratives that really connect with people? And who do we mean by people? About 60% of our visitors are tourists, and they may never come again. How can we highlight that humans are part of nature and part of a bigger Earth systems, this kind of systems thinking approach, which is I think is a very difficult nut to crack? How can we encourage careful and action to protect the natural systems we interact with and depend on for all of our futures? And when I say all of our, I obviously don't just mean humans. And how can we bring people together to reflect on and discuss these complexities and hopefully generate solutions for a more positive future? That's it.
Thanks so much, everyone. I think we'll probably have about 20 minutes discussion now, and then 20 minutes with questions from the audience. So start with some of your questions. And I've got something I'd like to start with. Also, you might have questions for each other.
Past is very important.
So again, the first thing, there's so many questions that are raised with your presentations. But, maybe the first question is to talk a little bit more about the importance of collaboration and sharing between institutions, and what kind of formats those take and how useful you find them. So there's conversations like this. There's formal collaborations where maybe you're working with the Smithsonian and how that works. And then there's maybe also collaborating with other institutions that kind of share knowledge, such as Julie's Bicycle. I think maybe all of you are working with.
Yep.
So it would be great to hear from maybe all of you what you found particularly useful or your experiences.
Well, one of the things that I set up was about 6 months ago. I realised that all the museums I knew were doing this kind of work or beginning to think about it and perhaps not quite knowing what to do. And we're all making the same mistakes and all duplicating effort and not learning from each other or finding shortcuts. So the Horniman is nationally funded, and we're part of a group called the National Museum Directors Council, which actually also includes all of the Arts Council funded regional museums, the NPOs. So it's quite a big group, about 40 odd significant museums. And I said we should set up a working group. So we've now set up a working group on environment and ecology issues in museums. We had an initial meeting at the Museums Association conference last October. We've had, because we're spread out all over the country, we've actually had quite a useful series of video conferences where people are using Zoom, people have just had a presentation or had a discussion. And we're now having a national conference, basically on the same theme as this, at Tate Modern on the 21st of April, which is being advertised next week, precisely because there wasn't enough thinking and collaboration going on. I'm also setting up at the moment a touring exhibitions network for regional museums and the Horniman to try and develop a more sustainable model of exhibitions. Because again, there are touring exhibitions, but not many. Most museums do their own exhibitions and then they throw the stuff away. So it's trying to develop a sustainable model for touring for a certain size, smaller than these national museums. But
Or they charge one another lots of money as well. You know.
Yeah. Well, actually, pool resources.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, I'm just thinking from my perspective, and maybe I shouldn't say this as we're being recorded, but you know, it's become so monetized. You know, not necessarily always for smaller institutions, but it's, you know, things do cost money to transport, and there are sort of inherent costs, but it's also that sort of we need an attitudinal shift, I think, in the museum sector about sharing knowledge and collections, and not necessarily using it as kind of grand profiteering in that way. But we all have holes in the budget to fill, so it's very tricky. Sorry, Nick, I cut you off.
That was all I was going to say, actually.
We used to have a radical department in the museum, sort of between the 50s and the 70s. It got disbanded with some sort of spurious excuse about government policy. It was called the circulation department, and it collected the contemporary, because the museum had started to become quite sort of connoisseurial and not really collecting anything that was less than 50 years old. And so this department, by stealth, just collected loads of amazing, it's like hoover up what's going on in art schools or European kind of industrial product design at that time, which in the 50s and 60s was hugely exciting. And then they would sort of send these package shows off around the country to working men's clubs, to schools, to regional museums. And we've been thinking about, what would it mean to recirculate in different ways and in new ways. And we're having some of these conversations with partners around the country. But also, what's interesting is how could, maybe it's slightly off topic for today, but distributing the museum and the museum's work in different ways. That collections don't necessarily have to travel, but there are other ways of sharing ideas. And it's just, I found that department so inspiring as both being very serious about contemporary practice, but also wanting to reach a much broader audience.
Yeah, and Lilly, you're setting up.
Trying to.
Yeah, one thing. So I've had initial conversations with a lot of different organisations. So the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh, for example, the Natural History Museum of Denmark, the Natural History Museum in Berlin. So these kinds of places. And I think one thing I've noticed, so it's really encouraging to see that pretty much all of these places have the same appetite to be having these conversations and engaging their audiences with these sorts of concepts. Like everyone's waking up to the time that we're living in, which is really, really great. Something that's also definitely become evident is that, and so the NHM is the only museum I've ever worked in, and it's kind of become apparent that there isn't really a lot of, from what I can see, there hasn't been a huge amount of sharing with specific. So one example might be we have an audience research team at the museum, so which is great, so that we can fully understand, well, how did the public respond to our exhibitions and our galleries and that kind of thing, and what is the public's space and awareness like in terms of, you know, how they feel about climate change and that sort of thing. But not every museum, you know, small museums may not have that. And so, for example, sharing that audience insight information, does that happen? Why would it not happen? I think is a fair enough question. Because actually, you know, I personally feel that audience insight information is a really crucial starting point. You need to know who you're communicating with and where they sit attitudinally or whatever it might be. So why aren't we showing that? And you know, when so the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh, they had an exhibition. I can't remember what it was called now, but it had Anthropocene in the title, and it was maybe 2 years ago or so. And we just kind of tentatively asked, would you be happy to share your summative evaluation, so we could just see how did, and they were like, oh, yeah, that's fine, but that isn't, so when we try, at our museum, when I'm trying to establish this global network, well, maybe that's something that should just be much more fluid, so we can just learn from each other much more seamlessly. And as a colleague in the NHM in Berlin said to me, we're never going to steal visitors from each other. We exist in very different spaces, so why not try and learn from each other more fluently? And I think just on the concept of collaborating, I'm quite, from what I can see of the museum, like we haven't worked together with artists and designers that much, here and there. But it's always the situation where, you know, if we have a performer or an artist at one of our lates, it seems to double the amount of work. And so there's an immediate barrier there because we're not used to doing it. And so, you know, it's more resource, you know, we're going to have to function differently in that space and all of that. And that's a shame because there are some concepts that I think could be really powerful, but we struggle to do with our objects alone. And so actually collaborating with, you know, whether that's a VR thing or whatever, and bringing new experiences to audiences could be really powerful. So I think maybe we just need to get better at working with people like that.
Yeah, I mean, we have a lates program too. We had an Anthropocene late recently, and it's a tried and tested sort of method format for the V&A, and it sort of started about 15 or so years ago when I first worked at the museum. And you know, and it takes a long time to embed those sorts of direct interventions, especially into museums of that scale. And now everybody's quite used to 5,000 to 6,000 people turning up for 3 hours on a Friday night and kind of transgressing all over the place. But what happens sometimes with certain subjects, we as part of the sort of piloting and testing of collaborations that we wanted to do with around V&A East, which sort of speaks to the sort of attitude that we're trying to build about the institution. We worked with a young collective before they went stratospheric called Galdem to program a night about women of colour across the museum. And with that late and with others subsequently, where the subjects are very specific, might be addressing climate change, the frustration becomes one of, well, this is great, but it's just for a Friday night. Like, where is the rest of it? Why is it not being imbued in programs and displays? And it is this slow, you know, move towards, you know, changing things that you were describing, Camilla, especially for museums of the scale of South Ken, where a gallery is designed with a lifespan of 25 years, which is a very long time.
Yeah, and so, sorry, go.
No.
Go.
Well, one thing I think is such a challenge going forward is the rate of change that we're going to have to accommodate ourselves to. As in, there is new information about the climate coming out all the time. 1.5 degrees and now 2 degrees. What does that mean? What are they going to be the implications to us? And I think everybody's spoken a little bit about the need to be agile and how to make your institutions react quickly to things. And some of them seem a little bit almost like, you know, trying to make the institution work in a very different way than it's used to. And the larger institutions, that's a certain project. Nick, I don't know if you have anything particularly to how you can work with kind of new information about the climate change that is happening very quickly and how that might affect. Do you have? You're not building your collection. That would be.
We are, yes, but not at the rate of the Natural History Museum, for example. But yes, but I mean, as an aside, I'll answer your question. In looking at the long term for the Horniman, because museums have one thing, which is that they are institutions of the long term.
Yeah.
So I've always said it's actually part of their moral and ethical imperative to call out some of these issues that short-term funding and politics are not dealing with. Because we can go back to we've got Natural History Museum has got objects older than the Earth, meteorites and things, and we are supposed to be in for posterity, whatever that means. So there's that long-term view is really important. But that has meant that the museum culture is very slow. And particularly gallery, it's quite clunky. And even doing a temporary exhibition, you're booked up, you plan 3 to 5 years in advance sometimes in some of the large, because you can't, even rapid response collecting is not that rapid, So, so I think the same is for every museum really. The structures are not there. So there does need to be a new working culture brought in as an additional layer. And for me, that's very much around people. Because actually a museum label is just a substitute for speaking to somebody. And if you ideally, everybody would be conducted around one by an informed guide who would be able to modulate their interpretation to the audience there. So labels are just a shortcut for that. So I don't have the answer, but you can have even the Horniman's Natural History Gallery or any ones at the NHM which are really old. The collections have these infinite number of stories that can be brought out, and it's actually having a means other than refurbishing the whole gallery or redoing the labels. And that's got to be around performance, possibly AR and things people carry in their self-guiding technologies. Certainly in smaller museums, having visitor hosts who are not primarily security but are there to engage people and have iPads with additional information. That's one way of going forward. Using museum volunteers, trying to get that human contact. Almost impossible at half term in the Natural History Museum at the V&A because there's sheer numbers. So there's a lot of practicalities. But there's no doubt that we're going to fail to deal with the climate and planetary emergency unless museums learn to work differently. It doesn't mean stopping and changing everything we do, but it means adding that additional urgent layer of practice.
Yeah, and I think what you've demonstrated with your sort of turning of the mission of the Horniman and reappraising everything you're doing, you've got to put all of these policies at the centre of things. And we have, we're in the middle of, not me, the director and the executive board are in the middle of finalising our new strategic plan for the next 5 years, and it's that has changed markedly in terms of the priorities that are being put forward, and that's important to then, because it's got to be top down in some ways to make sure that that's at the centre of things, and these questions are driving decisions. But the rate of change, I don't know how to deal with that. It's interesting.
There are things that seemed reasonable 5 years ago that are not reasonable now, and you have to kind of reinvent while working in institutions that are about long-term preservation. How to.
Oh, and sorry, I meant to say something earlier but I got distracted. One of the things looking about the long term, we were modelling at the Horniman, said museums have a really unsustainable model because it's about constant growth. Not just the growth of collections, but also growth of buildings, growth of exhibitions and so on. What if we had a model for the future of each institution which was smaller? I mean, people's brains practically explode when you say that. Oh God, how do we do that? We have to make people redundant, and but actually at least not being any bigger is the only logical option, and possibly being smaller is more sustainable. But nobody's thinking about that at all. It's still, I'm afraid, it's about building new buildings.
For sure. But then it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because then you come back to this question of where do people find trusted sources? And and that's not an argument for massive growth and
reconciling myself to the expansion project in many ways, and and I think there's a lot of benefit that comes with that trade-off. But I think how do you protect, whether it's smaller and more, but definitely not smaller and fewer, these spaces for debate, for trusted knowledge and expertise, for action. And I think they're becoming increasingly important in our society as as everything else is sort of eroding. And you find, in our, we are doing a lot of active audience research in many different ways, but in our kind of just like, face-to-face discussions my team are having with future users and audiences across the Olympic boroughs in East London, with young people, with school teachers, with FE college tutors, with creative practitioners, arts organisations. It's really apparent that one of the benefits is the space of the museum, or the constellation of cultural organisations that will be going to the Olympic Park, as they will start to replace or could replace or provide the resources that local authorities are finding increasingly harder to keep going within their boroughs. So we're working with borough level, mayoral level to sort of address some of those things too. And these are all, so they're important spaces, but yes, maybe there needs to be some trimming of the fat, perhaps.
Yeah, it's an interesting kind of balance between making institutions very efficient so that they kind of minimise the resources they're using, but then at the same time maybe having a certain degree of redundancy to allow for space of creativity and the sort of unknown and the creation. So I think that's an interesting dilemma in terms of making extensions or expansions, and in a way with the V&A East, the idea of kind of creating a space that's neither a museum nor a storage space or something in between is quite interesting in terms of the density of the building, and using space very efficiently, but also making it accessible to people.
Yeah, it's a store in its temperature and climate control. It's got a lot of plant to keep everything in a perfect condition in that sense. But yeah, it is quite efficient, I think, in that sense. In that it will be rationalising space and problematic architecture across two sites, but also operational efficiencies will be made by just completely reconceiving of how we access, retrieve, work with collections, and just cutting down a number of steps in a process is automatically going to help. But then that leaves us room to do more. So then that's not, providing the
I think it's going to be quite. I was just thinking about what you were saying, because we have a lot of stuff. It's like a lot, and it continues to grow, and it needs to.
How many stores do you have? Do you know? Or the kind of,
I'm not the best
just was
person.
thinking of Catherine's storeroom that's being.
We do have a big off storage site in South London, and we are having to address the same problem. We have, our facilities are old; they're not all fit for purpose anymore, and so our museum is having to address the same issue of moving a significant proportion of our collections, and it's a very laborious, complicated process, which I happily don't have to get involved with. But what was I about to say? Yeah, when I think about things like, I wonder if just some more thoughtful, provocative programming and interventions could actually really kind of go a long way. And actually, one example, so I went to the Anthropocene late, and I was at the V&A last September, and I intended to just check out as much as possible, obviously, check out what they're doing. For my post, was so useful. And I sat down in this sort of workshop with 5 other women, and I didn't move for like an hour and 20 minutes, and it honestly was the most unbelievable. And so we were just chatting back and forth about sort of climate justice, and I'm by no means an expert. I've read a few articles, I've read a book, but it was such an interesting and very well led discussion, and that was probably the most meaningful Lates experience I've ever had. I didn't see a single object. It was very people driven, because this is a very human, not to make it sound too anthropocentric, but we do need to be open and discussing these things if we're going to get anywhere. And I think it's an interesting balance between, so if you look at our, we have a gallery which is our birds gallery, and it gets so clogged, it's just a constant bottleneck, because people love, which is great, so people love the birds, so they'll just stop and they'll look at them and it'll be like, wow. But it's very much, they're specimens, and then the amount of interpretation there. I think there was a short panel on one end, but that's very much about, so there's nothing about ecosystems or biodiversity or anything like that. I'm trying to think, it's more sort of about the anatomy of a bird and how it does this and that sort of thing. And the information that you get with the specimens is the scientific name and the common name. Who's going to, no one's going to remember that scientific name unless you're really particularly interested. And so part of me is kind of like, is that moving people? Is it kind of driving them in the right direction? But then the other part of me is like, people love it. People still stop. They're really wowed by these specimens. So it's this interesting balance of we don't want to lose that hook. But that kind of like I was saying, we also want to take that and be doing more.
It's an interesting thing you can do. I mean, you probably know Bristol Museum did a very simple thing, which just put shrouds over all the extinct and endangered animals, which was a lot of them, you know, for a limited period. So surprising interventions, and actually sometimes upsetting people, I think is entirely legitimate.
It is legitimate, because we all should be pretty upset by now. So,
I was interested, a couple of you have talked about, in a way, like, actually I think everyone has talked about how to instigate your visitors to become kind of active, quite politically active. I mean, that's maybe one of the things is kind of galvanising people to action, kind of fear and theory. But usually the role of the museum is to educate people, and where the climate and ecological catastrophe emergency, you know, turns into kind of terror and inability to act. You see that particularly probably with teenagers or people, younger people that visit the museum. I mean, I feel it, I'm sure we all feel it now and then. And how not to let that climate terror be overwhelming and to use it as a way to galvanise action. I mean, I suppose each of you have talked about that as a role, but that the museum can do, that it's not just educating, but also inspiring action, but without terror. I don't know if you've found that, not in the responses maybe of anger against Extinction Rebellion, or maybe it is in that, because that is engaging with the process.
Yeah, that's definitely
what
engagement.
What do we value? Why should it be in a museum? And yes or no, I agree with that.
I think what we're finding with the audience research that we're doing is it's a really fine balance to, there's education, inspiration, and galvanizing to act. But people also go to museums to switch off, for pleasure, for a different kind of joy. And sometimes with these subjects, they feel battered over the head, and they don't want to come into an environment which feels like they're watching the news. And so it's really quite tricky in that sense to strike the right tone, and these sort of very human-centric kind of points of view that where you can spark empathy, I think, is a really good starting point for introducing and inspiring and working your way around the terror, but also just not turning people off, because then that's kind of, apathy, and that's tricky, but it's hard, because a lot of people, they have a lot of stuff to deal with in their daily lives in lots of different ways, and they don't want to be preached at.
I wonder if that's different, Nick, slightly. I don't know if your visitors tend to be more of a local community, slightly, and so you have more repeat, potentially, kind of engagement.
Yeah.
Not that there aren't repeat engagement in the larger institutions, but as a percentage of your visitors.
You have to understand the context you're operating in, and I think the Horniman's very different. You're absolutely, from the South Kensington Museum, you're right. 10% of our visitors are tourists, and a lot of those are actually visiting friends and family in the area themselves. 70% of our audience are local, and the local boroughs and nearby in Surrey and Kent, and they come again and again. I often meet people who say, oh, we come 50 times a year. You know, we come once a week with the kids. And as I said, we've done quite a lot of research, and there is, you know, there's of course a broad spectrum of people who just want to come for a nice time, but at the same time, there's a growing, partly because of this anxiety, there's a growing desire to say, what can I do positively for my kids and not panic, and you know, think, well, their future's ruined. I can't admit that as a parent. I want to be positive. We want rigorously informed, scientifically backed information and some practical actions, but not hit over the head. So our plans for our new galleries are to highlight some of the things that are going on, and we've got an environmental action zone, rather separate, for people who want to take it further, which will do things like say, well, here's information about local groups that you can join, or here are some actions you can undertake, and here's some practical stuff.
Yeah.
But you don't all have to do it, or feel guilty that you're not doing it. But it's very subtle, and I don't think any of us have actually got it right, and probably never will. But there is a demand, I think, out there, certainly from on the local level.
Yeah, and I think that will be what will be interesting for V&A East in you know, trying to sort of strike a different tone and a kind of, you know, set of local relationships, and how can we make it a place that people go to regularly and build a conversation with your visitors, and so they can see change over time, and there are reasons to come back, because it's, you know, it's a living, breathing institution, not a dead one in that sense.
One of the worries we have, incidentally, is that we are, like all museums, trying to diversify our audience, and we're worried that all this stuff is seen as quite a middle-class white pursuit.
Yeah.
And so we're trying to find ways in which we can harness the ambitions around the planetary emergency with an audience diversification agenda, because those two things have to go together. We can't have this as just another middle-class, do-gooders pursuit. So, for example, we're working with climate refugees who have moved to Lewisham or locally because of climate-related migration forces, to try and give that voice. But it's, again, it is a worry. You know.
And also with a collection of world cultural artifacts, you're able to have very different conversations about relationships with the natural world, you know, processes of agriculture, cultural production, all sorts of, you know, I think it's easy to fall into the trap, and this is what we're looking at the moment. How do we get ourselves out of our kind of, you know, Western point of view or bias in our thinking?
But maybe on what you're saying, maybe there's something to be said just for highlighting that you acknowledge that there is really significant unjust disparity in terms of who's most responsible, who's most affected, and by giving a platform to that very fact, you're at least acknowledging that you see this, and that it's not a just situation, and we need to be addressing it together.
Well, you're absolutely right. So the conclusion we've come to is that we can't tackle environmental justice without also linking it to social justice.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you said about, I think you referred to it as climate terror, which is chilling. But yeah, we and I think about this as well in terms of, I think often we sort of perceive a bit of a binary in terms of, oh, there's individual change and there's systemic change. And it's almost like, oh, why bother with the former when actually we just need the latter? When in reality we're human beings and perhaps we need both. Because systemic change, it can feel like such an impenetrable thing. How am I as an individual going to be driving this kind of unbelievably entrenched change, that systems that we've been used to for however many years? Those individual actions could be a very subtle thing of feeling empowered for yourself as an individual. So we basically need both, I would argue. And so for one kind of camp, if you like, to sort of shame the other and say that's pointless, is so counterproductive and not particularly helpful.
Well, it's interesting that two organisations have made a kind of top-down public declaration, and that then everyone's galvanising individuals to act. And I think clearly about the way that our economy works now and the way that consumption works on an individual level, major changes will have to be made.
Yeah, I think sorry.
No.
Yeah, no, I completely. I think it's interesting. Like you've created, you've published a manifesto, and in a way you've sort of signed up to different agreements. But yeah, the idea of a manifesto, which kind of a sort of public declaration that you're going to be held to, it seems quite important. I mean, and I think that's quite interesting, where other people can also learn from that and take on. I mean, since Lucia's not here, Hans of Obrist was talking about sort of, in a sort of semi-manifesto, talking about slow programming, which we've covered a little bit already, slow programming, and, which he talks about as long durational projects that expand beyond the conventional limits of a museum or a finite exhibition. Works will be in the galleries outside of the park, off-site in London, internationally, online, and within the web of ideas and relationships. Spun from encounters among back-to-earth collaborators, projects and the public. He also talks about the idea of not shipping artworks around the world, but instead artists providing instructions so that they can be made, produced locally, and so we can minimise waste and transport costs. And also the idea of, I mean, even down to the detail of like not writing as many emails, because the digital has a huge energy impact too, which can't be ignored. So I think the idea of manifesto is really important. I think. I mean, how did you find?
Well, we decided, having declared the emergency, which is really easy, we just said let's just do it, you know. And then we said, well, what does that actually mean? And we thought, well, we need to set out what we're actually going to do to address this. And in a way, we set ourselves a series of targets as a way of forcing us to do them. By making a public declaration, we've got to be held to do them. And actually, that's a really good galvanizing, because you know it's always otherwise. It's mañana, you know, we'll get there eventually. So it was to force. It was really essentially just to say we're going to do it, and then we're going to work out how to do it later.
And we're definitely at a time now where museums and other institutions are really being scrutinised and held accountable more and more. And it's difficult, but it's a good thing. We should be held accountable.
Yeah, I had one other question. We might move on to the audience soon, but just about the role of nature and how important you think it is in literally engaging with nature in your institutions, as well as obviously through the works themselves. But you've got acres of land, and you know you've both got public spaces and exterior spaces. So I mean, and also you know you're actually creating coral. And how important do you think that is in moving forwards and really engaging with literally with plants and animals?
I never thought about it. I don't know whether there's anything special about living as opposed to heritage collections. I won't say dead collections. Engagement with the authentic is really important, however we define that. I think there is something important about engaging with the outdoors and with the living things outdoors, because there's a different quality of experience outdoors from indoors. But the sort of indoor heritage experience and the outdoor quasi-nature experience can be equally beneficial. But I think there's some quite good, and there's good research now about culture and well-being and cultural engagement. I think outside it's particularly good for wider audiences. And actually we're doing things like introducing sustainable gardening as one of our things. So we've got, you know, it's just a different quality of experience. I don't think they're necessarily, one is superior to the other, but if you've got those opportunities, it's fantastic.
Yeah, I guess it's an architectural challenge in a way. How do you bring it outside in and vice versa?
Yeah, I mean, so relatively few people probably know that we have a wildlife garden, and that garden is, I can't remember the figure. It's relatively small, but we have over 500 species of moth that visit that garden, which is quite extraordinary in quite an urban space. And if you have a look at the strategy, we talk about the urban nature project. So we do have a project to really kind of put a lot of focus on an outdoor space, and so through that space we'll be talking about deep time, history of time, and looking at human presence in that kind of timeline as well. But I think connecting, so I guess whether it's through an outdoor space or not, I think what you initially asked about in terms of our connection to nature and the way in which we talk about it, I mean, I can't help doing it either, but we are absolutely part of nature, but the way that we've evolved as a species and the way we exist now, that's just not how we go about our day-to-day lives. That's not how it feels like us and nature and stuff. When we know in this room that that's not how it is. But, you know, I can go food shopping and not even have to question what I'm buying, where it's come from, or any of that. I can just go and buy it and not even think about it if I don't want to. And I think, yeah, obviously at the Natural History Museum, yes, connections with all of the natural world is really, really crucial for us. And sometimes I think about it in such even simplistic terms, such as, so if you look at the BBC Landmark series, for example, all the Blue Planets, Frozen Planet, Planet Earth 2, and, you know, hundreds of millions of viewers all over the world, because people are inspired by the natural world. There's something that is breathtaking for us. And although our collections aren't quite as showy as what the BBC is able to kind of put a spotlight on, that's what I'm kind of keen to do, is kind of look at our collections and sort of touch on that point of awe and inspiration and fascination, even if it's just raising awareness of how trees communicate through their root and mycorrhizal fungi system underground, how they share nutrients with their kin. And that's something we didn't know about trees until about 20, 30 years ago. You know, and it's kind of crazy, and trees have been doing it for millions of years, and it is beautiful. And I'm, as you can probably tell, I'm confident and an advocate that people are switched on by this. I think they're amazed by it, and hopefully, you know, the more people feel that way, the more they'll be invested, they'll care, etc., etc.
Great. Okay. Thanks so much. Well, does anyone have questions?
Yeah, I don't know if Nick answered this at the very beginning, but I just wondered, and I think you're all public institutions, whether the government declaration of a climate emergency has had any actual demands by government on you as public institutions, and whether there's a conversation between you and government. And just while I have the microphone, I just want to say a few other things before you get to respond to that. I also wondered if you have switched as institutions to renewable energy, because that's one of the simplest things that any institution can do. I'm from the film industry and I'm doing an initiative within film, and at the moment we're trying to lobby all the studios to switch to renewable, because this thing of resistance to change, well, that's literally a signing of a contract, and it's the easiest thing. The other thing is that I'm really encouraged to hear about your point about collaboration within the industry, because I think, you know, none of us can give 100% of our time to this, because we all have jobs. And what I'm finding with what I'm doing is that there are a lot of people within my industry, and we're trying to connect with each other as early as possible, because the danger is doubling each other's work. And what we actually should be doing is learning from each other and progressing and sort of developing. And then the other thing was just a point about lighting and LED, that there are some things that we still don't know. So I was on a climate panel last weekend, and I asked the gaffer on James Bond, what's more sustainable, a old tungsten light on renewable source mains, or a new LED on battery power that's been charged by a renewable source? And he doesn't know. So even the experts don't know, because LED have their own issues with fabrication and disposal. And yeah, so just there's the danger of the emperor's clothes of, like, in terms of the practical things, the latest best thing to do. But yeah, if you could respond to the government question, because my industry doesn't have that at all, because we're a commercial industry, so we can't relate to that.
But I think the sad answer is, because of all the political mess we've been in, actually there's been no follow-up. And I think it was Parliament that declared a climate emergency, not the government. So it's not government policy to deal with the climate emergency. And DCMS, our main funder, have been very pleased that we're doing these things, but they're not demanding it. Arts Council, who also fund the Horniman, have a much more proactive, in their 10-year strategy, one of the big investment principles is around environment, and they want all of their funded bodies now to say what they're doing about this. So and they employ Julie's Bicycle as a way of sort of gathering information and supporting people. So Arts Council are very on it, government not. I'm hoping with COP26 happening in Glasgow in November, that will result in the government and all the government departments really waking up and driving this. And it's only through government taking a lead that we'll have the infrastructure we need in terms of renewables. And to go on to your renewable thing, yes, all DCMS funded organisations, so that's the ones here, have their energy supplied by Crown Commercial Services, who get bulk discounts because they've got a lot of clients. And they do offer a renewable tariff, which we are in the process of switching to. It's easy enough. But it's renewable in name only because you purchase REGO certificates, which are renewable energy certificates. And there's a lot of criticism, really. You're really just entering into a certificate trading system, and you can't show that the energy that you actually get is from renewable sources. So one of the aims of this group that I've convened is to actually get enough people to go back to the supplier and say, we want properly, not just a traded certificate, but we want properly renewable, from some guaranteed 100% renewable resources. Like I think Scottish Power now does that, and Ecotricity and a few of the others. But as you say, it's very complicated. I bought a hybrid car and mainly go on the electric battery. The electric batteries are, ruining the African and Australian landscape through open cast mining for cobalt and so on. So the more you go into it, this is why we need to share so much in television.
Exactly. And you use the word complexities in your presentation. This is the challenge of these subjects in terms of public discourse around them, is this, that you do something over here and then it opens up 10 other challenges that way. And how do you communicate the interlocking of everything? And mobile phone, mineral mining at great expense, it's all so entangled. It's a tricky one. I don't know if we use renewable energy. I'm sorry, I have to confess, but I know what we're doing at the moment is a massive estates audit of our entire portfolio to assess what needs to be done, what we need to continue to do, and what we need to change. But I do know that our heating comes from the Natural History Museum. And so when they turn it off, it gets turned off at the museum because it's Albertopolis and all connected in this kind of mad and antiquated way. And probably we can tunnel under our building and under the road and pop up in your office or something. I don't know.
A certain proportion of our energy does come from renewables. I can't give you the exact figure, I'm afraid. We have a head of sustainability who knows all of this stuff in great detail. If you have specific questions about how we function, I can definitely find out that kind of information for you, sure.
Any other questions? Camilla, did you want to just touch on the government, the first question?
My understanding, so I'm possibly not the best person to ask from the museum, but my understanding and awareness is very similar to Nick's. That I don't think there's been much drive in that direction from them. That's what my understanding is too. I'm possibly not the best person, but that's my awareness.
I think, and you mentioned COP26 this year. I think the museum, the V&A, is the official design partner for that, and we are tuning all of our London Design Festival activity this year to COP26. And your 21st of April for the event at Tate Modern is Earth Day.
Yep.
So there'll be galvanising around that, and we've been speaking with the Earth Day sort of convener at the Smithsonian about doing things in the long term. And I think these sort of moments of public consciousness are important, actually, simple strategies for raising these issues on quite a large scale level.
So I have kind of a question related to the idea of the complexity of the situation, this idea of trust, the global nature of all of your collections and how they were acquired, and also to Nick's point about this being a social issue as well as an environmental issue. How are each of your museums kind of thinking about the disproportionality of climate change in relation to also the different places your collections come from, and those communities and working with climate refugees, et cetera.
Well, one thing, at the Horniman, we've revamped, the good thing about coming in fairly new, you can change things, so we've revamped our international strategy. In fact, we didn't have one before, and as a part of that, most of it was research. So unlike quite a lot of museums have been chasing opportunities in the Gulf and in China, because that's where the money is for exhibitions, and the Horniman can't really compete in those markets. So we've decided that our international strategy should be based around former colonial countries from which our collections were derived. And we've, as an example of that, we've got some government funding, interestingly, to do a project called Rethinking Relationships and Building Trust around African collections, which is, instead of saying, looking at restitution, looking at future relationships, in which case we hope by engaging with colleagues in this instance, first of all in Nigeria and Kenya, documenting more thoroughly the circumstances in which our collections were acquired, and in many cases it is through unequal power relations, to put it mildly, and talking with those colleagues in those countries and also diaspora communities in London about the future of those, where those collections, how those collections might be best cared for and where. And our trustees are going to look at the report in the autumn. And that's not directly to do with climate and environment, but it's to do with the broad global sweeps that have led to the situation we have now. And as I said, we're beginning to look at climate refugees as well. So it's all part of a sort of, as I said, the Horniman was founded by Quakers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, interested in global issues around intercultural understanding and justice. And we're reviving that 100 years or so later and say, what does that mean now? And what is an ethical curatorship at the global level for the 21st century? And we don't know yet, but we're trying to find out by doing and by asking.
Yeah, I guess my answer would be similar too. It's a sort of constant inquiry into understanding our collections in different ways and in new ways, and production of knowledge. I was just reminded me, going back to the mahogany kind of story, we have a very active big research department at the V&A. It was one of I think it was the first museum in the world to establish an academic research department working independently of research that is coming from, you know, exhibitions making and things like that. And we have lots of different fellows who come in and out for purposes of public engagement or scholarship around a particular subject. But we had a fellow called Hannah Young a few years ago, who's a young social historian who came up through UCL's sort of colonial histories divisions. And she spent sort of 18 months looking into our collections to try and track objects that were purchased by or owned by slave owners, and the way in which those objects are constructions of taste in the 19th century particularly. So especially sort of more middle class, kind of merchant class people who were trying to sort of create an identity for themselves through art and design and craft, and what that, you know, what those objects mean, where they've come from, how they've come into the museum, and the complexity of those kind of networks in that empire sort of colonial moment. And again, not so closely related to climate, although you can track and kind of make connections. But these opportunities to really dive deep and work with different scholars, with people directly from the communities that we're trying to explore. We did a project with around the sort of very sort of bleak moment in British history, around the Magdala raids in Ethiopia. We hold objects from those raids. The son of the emperor was brought to England to be looked after by Queen Victoria. Deeply troubling sort of moment in British history, but we worked with Ethiopian scholars and diaspora communities here in the UK, members of staff who are Ethiopian, to look at what meaning, resonance, histories, making more problematizing the objects in the collection, trying to tell a kind of true account of facts, of events, and then giving many different perspectives on what these objects mean, how they should be seen, where they should be seen, and how we hold them. And these are ongoing, institutional questions that every museum with these kind of collections faces. And I think there's often a view that everything comes from empire raiding, and that's not true. So it's about trying to look at the multiple ways that things enter into the collection, and that's one of the sort of dimensions of our research and exploration for the collection centre. Actually, it's just like opening up, collecting histories, because it's about problematic, moments in our past, but it's also about the taste of an individual for a very long time, which can, swerve your collections in very different directions. So it's quite fascinating in that sense. I don't think I've answered your question, but Hannah Young, great young researcher. Check her out.
I can sort of briefly say, a very sort of similar position. It's conversations that I'm not particularly privy to, but those aspects of the issues around colonialism, those conversations are absolutely being had. And there are other aspects of, so for example, you can look on our website and read about how aspects of our collections are quite interwoven with the slave trade. There's lots of work to be done. But on your point of, you asked about how we might approach the kind of social injustice around some of these issues. And I think for us, we're definitely still trying to figure out I feel like up until this point, there's been a tendency for us to really focus on, well, what can we be a voice of authority on? What's our kind of key strengths? And we'll focus on that, and that will be the way forwards. And to a degree, I really do agree with that, but we can't talk about things like the environmental emergency and not open the doors to all these other conversations which are really deeply entangled with the areas on which we feel we are an authority. So even if it's not a case of our museum saying, let's talk about this subject and it has to align with what we believe as a museum, it may well be just opening up a space so that people feel they can come to our museum, have those discussions and debates, which is what I'm really pushing for.
Can I just say something else? I was going to, as part of the rapid response collecting, going to show an object that we collected recently, a couple of years ago now. But it's essentially a big phone that looks like a really old mobile phone. It's made in China, but it's designed specifically by a West African market where there's lots of different power shortages and electricity sort of issues throughout the course of using your phone. So it's big because it's got a big battery, and you can charge other phones from this phone or other things from this phone. And so these sort of moments of, it's one object, but it holds a lot of sort of power and stories that you can tell around different environments around the world and how design is reacting to that and creating new products that serve a particular need in a particular place. And I think those ways of illuminating through the object out is also a very sort of rich and powerful way to communicate the complexities and the diversity.
I find it, it's been really interesting to hear about, your sort of like visions for the future, but I've been sitting through and I just can't get out of my mind the recent, like over the last couple of years, like funding in the arts and, the Sackler Foundation at the V&A and ARMS sort of dealing links to the Serpentine Gallery and BP at the British Museum. And it just feels like that is kind of, if museums are sort of obviously have these very, almost it's like a kind of utopian idea and like wanting to be a kind of ethical and moral leader in a way, I imagine these conversations must be kind of going on behind the scenes, but like, it sort of just seems like it should be part of this discussion in a way.
Yep.
Yeah.
Maybe, Nick, could you talk a bit about transparency in the, because you have a very transparent, I think, on your website.
Yes, I mean, we don't have the opportunity to turn down BP sponsorship because we're not at that sort of level. But to be honest, we would. And we've thought about this because we're about to embark on a fundraising campaign for this project I was mentioning. And we do have an ethical approach. And it has, if you're a values-driven organisation, you have to live those values in every aspect. And museums of all kinds, and particularly art galleries dealing with the international art market, are quite compromised and need to think through, I think. And it's not only sponsorship, but also it's research funding for some of the larger museums, because sometimes funding is from extractive industries, for example. And I think you've got to, so BP is a good one, or the other oil companies, because some people say, well, actually, these fossil fuel companies, they know they've got to get out of it, and they've got to invest in renewable technologies, and that's true, and they say that. But they're only investing 1% in it at the moment, while continuing to explore new fossil fuel, new oil fields, and even kind of more or less saying, well, if the ice sheets and the permafrost melts, then that opens up new resources for us. So that doesn't fit well if you're saying, well, we're dealing with a climate and ecological emergency. So I think it's always a case-by-case basis, both for the individual potential funder and for the individual organisation. But I note that quite a lot of arts organisations are now going away from association with fossil fuels and others. The problem is we don't have lots of alternatives at the moment. So in theory, what you'd like to do is imagine that museums would get sponsorship from a host of new green industrial companies, but they're not really there yet. But that's what we have to hope and encourage, because otherwise we're going to be impoverished further. And maybe that's one thing, a bullet we have to bite, saying, well, actually, we'll forego this money and just reduce our programming commensurately. I know Tate has just said no to BP, and I think it's finding money from elsewhere because it's Tate. But you know, it's an active decision you have to take as an organisation, and to me, the values must come first.
And maybe some lovely philanthropists will come forward off the back of that.
You never know.
I mean, that goes down to even like the detail of which banks the museums are using as well, which is also quite an easy thing to change. But the banks are who they're investing in is critical.
It's difficult to find clean money. It's just
exactly.
degrees of
Yeah,
greatness.
that would be my
Yeah.
contribution to this topic. It's fair to say there's divisions of opinion as to how that rolls out in reality.
But as we said before, like it's on a trajectory now, and that's not going away. And it would, I can't really, I think it was maybe 1 or 2 weeks ago, what happened at the British Museum. I don't know if you saw on Twitter that there was like a protest at the British Museum because it was, what's the exhibition?
Troy.
Was it Troy? Yeah. And it's very, very prominently supported by BP, and that I feel like at the moment we just can't be, you can't get away without being held to scrutiny now. But I have to say, like I do totally agree. It can come down to a case-by-case basis, and I appreciate that not everyone will potentially agree with that. But it is very difficult to find totally pure, clean money. Right, yeah.
Anyway, well, I think we should wrap up probably. But thank you so. Any final questions or over? No?
Thank you for staying so long.
Well, thank you so much.
Yes.
I just wanted to bring it back to the buildings that you're showing, like the V&A's.
It feels like the objects that are being currently displayed at the Horniman, they're really fun, really creative and playful, and actually the architecture of the museums, like currently being built at V&A East, are kind of with the thinking as we were 10 years ago. And I just wonder how much this kind of curatorial approach is impacting what you're building now as museum institutions. Whether there's been any crossover, and how, I suppose the closest we got to it in this discussion was talking about a new typology of storage/visitor space, and perhaps shrinking the back of house to make the front of house more efficient somehow. But how is this kind of curatorial program hopefully going to impact like the architecture of the museums in the future, in a sentence?
Yeah, I think, well, with our buildings, you know, it's a case of, we've been working closely with the architects on the public spaces that we want to create and the feeling of those and the encounter that we want people to have in the spaces, but it doesn't stop with the architecture of the building. It will be the next phase of design, working with designers on the gallery environments and overlaying on the kind of shell of the architecture, I think, which is where you'll start to see, I think, if we brief and work together with the right practices, a different type of, for the V&A anyway, a different type of kind of encounter, and that comes through space, through atmosphere, through display, through what museums want in terms of the relationships with visitors, you know, and it's like it's hard. 4 million people come through your door every day. No one goes up to the ceramics galleries. If you're ever needing quiet time, come up and spend time in the ceramics galleries. But actually, with a smaller museum, you want it to, if not have a domestic feel, be inviting and welcoming, and a place like that you want to return to all the time. And you can, you know, the design and the sort of spatial moves that you make and the gestures in choice of materials, of furniture, of you know, invitation to dwell, if you like, is going to be critical. And the store, I guess the collection centre is different again, and that image shows a bit of it and not the kind of front door and the common room and kind of entry territory where you know, there'll be spaces for study and workshops for doing things and places to hang out and be a bit more like a kind of civic sort of library space, I suppose. So, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess I'm interested in your view that you think it's like 10 years out of date already, but then I guess some things aren't they? It's sort of so slow that it can't keep up with itself.
At the time, when you do temporary exhibitions, they say to you as the architect, like, you need to reuse all the materials that have been used in this temporary exhibition. And yet you're putting that exhibition on in a new, massive concrete frame building. There's quite a lot of hypocrisy in that, and I suppose the question for some of us here who hopefully may be designing museums in the future will be about how these sort of really, like, you know, playful studies can start coming into the architecture and the materials that we're using in museum design.
I mean, our understanding about problems of concrete, for example, is still kind of coming to terms with that as an industry in a big way. The building industry doesn't tend to move so quickly.
Okay, well, thank you so much, everyone. Yeah, Nick.
Such a great. Okay, there are cocktails.
Being blended right now.